Thanks so much for joining me today on this post-Davos Fireside Chat. Of course, this year we all know that at Davos there was a very significant theme that kept everyone really busy, obviously being the war in Ukraine. But still, alongside that, there were lots of discussions around sustainability and ESG. And I think what we've seen in the past few years, every time there's been a crisis, so in 2020 with the pandemic, and then earlier this year with the war in Ukraine starting, every time we might have paused and thought, what does this mean for our work in corporate sustainability and ESG? And will it have to take a back seat? And interestingly enough, every time it got amplified. And I think we saw that also this year at Davos, the themes there, around the food crisis, the energy crisis, the climate crisis, but also the opportunities for business were definitely a red thread throughout the conversations. So today I wanted to speak more broadly about, what my fellow panelists feel is the influence of Davos today. Is it still significant, and how? And how is it impacting maybe responsible business more broadly, as well as their companies in particular? So it's very exciting for me to be able to introduce you to three great authorities in this space. I'll start with Robert Metzke, who's at Philips. He's a member of the innovation and strategy management team there, where he has a double role. So he's both the head of sustainability as well as chief of staff, innovation and strategy. So welcome, Robert. We're also joined by Amanda Gardiner. She's at Meta. She is in charge and the leader of the sustainability, innovation and engagement at Meta. And she is in charge of driving the evolution of the company's ESG strategy and reporting. And then we're also joined by Katherine Neebe from Duke Energy. She's the Vice President of National Engagement and Strategy and Chief Sustainability Officer for Duke Energy. And she's also the President of the Duke Energy Foundation. So I think also just looking at the caliber of the people in this webinar today and the roles they have at their respective companies, it's again a testament to how ESG has elevated in the past few years. So yeah, let's kick it off, and I'll open the floor to any of you who would like to jump in. So the influence of Davos today, what's your perspective on that? Do you feel like the influence of Davos is increasing or decreasing? And how important is Davos for the strategic direction that your company is taking?
I think Davos matters more than ever, actually. And that's probably a pretty controversial statement because it's gathering the elite. But I think, the world is in an unprecedented, perhaps, level of uncertainty. We have got the war, yes, we're coming out of a pandemic. We've got rising consumer prices. We've got wages going down. All of these things are creating and contributing to an economic crisis that we're continuing to experience. And most experts say that we're going to experience for the foreseeable future. So Davos gathers all the folks operating in this context. We're talking about the issues, the challenges, and how we contribute to them. And the reality is that business can't survive in societies that fail, and uncertainty is a real threat. And so Davos is unique in bringing together the influencers around the world who play a part in this web of geopolitical and economic shifts. And if ESG is about how business mitigates risks and maximizes opportunities for societal benefit, I would argue Davos remains really the quintessential ESG conference. Leaders from business, government, civil society coming together to discuss the challenges facing the world. What does it look like to do business in the world today? Where else can a CEO get such an acute view of the business context in which they're operating? So my view is that it matters more than ever and will remain a predominant ESG place to be.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Amanda. I'm curious, Robert, do you agree? You were at Davos. Did you feel the same way? Did you feel like ESG was indeed a red thread through the conversations, and was it as prominent as we all hope it would be?
I think it definitely was. Maybe a couple of statements. I very much liked Amanda's framing of the discussion. I think not by accident, you put the statement format as a little bit provocative, Marjella. I think we need to unpack that, right? So what is Davos? I mean, Davos is more than a conference center, it is an institution where indeed a lot of people come together, not just the CEOs, but also indeed the ESG specialists, the NGOs, artists, activists. Not everybody is in the conference center, but the entire village, of course, is a meeting place, right? So in that sense, I think it is a platform that brings together a lot of people from around the world that have sometimes opposing views. And we live in a time that is increasingly polarizing. So if you ask me, what is the benefit of being there? I think it's important to be able to calibrate your views. And of course, you can challenge it and say, well, being in a bubble with the rich and the beautiful, so to say, is that helping to calibrate your views? But at least I think it's one of the important data points along the annual cycle, so to say, where people from very different backgrounds, geographies, political agendas, economic backgrounds, and so forth, come together and can have a meaningful dialogue. So if you ask me, I think in this time of increasing, let's say, volatility, we need not to unlearn or forget the culture of open and action-oriented dialogue. And as long as Davos NWF is seriously committed to make an effort to to enable that, I'm phrasing that very carefully. I think it will remain relevant, but definitely not the only platform.
Thank you, Katherine. Any thoughts on that?
I thought Amanda and Robert laid it out really beautifully. I come at these issues like climate change, economic mobility. These are really thorny, difficult problems, difficult challenges. And no one company, no one sector can solve them on their own. And so I think you need these forums where you're bringing all of these sectors of the economy together: civil society, academia, business, government, activists, artists, all of these different sectors coming together so that you really do have a forum to hear each other, to hear good suggestions, to hear challenge, so that we can get to a better place. So I really affirm where Amanda and Robert are suggesting we land.
Great.
Marjella, maybe coming back to your initial remarks, and I don't know whether you want to pick that up later, but you made a couple of things that triggered me, and I just wanted to pause them maybe, or for later on, but might be focused a lot on crisis. You mentioned COVID, you mentioned the war in Europe, which is terrible. But I think it's interesting from an ESG perspective to put these movements in the context of the underlying trends. I have always the feeling that we are looking at the earthquake and not at the moving earth crusts in the Andreas break, right? So to say, which we have been trying to stitch together with Scotch tape for the last 20 years. So when the earth is moving and we see an epidemic or we see an outbreak of geopolitical tensions in terms of a war, then suddenly the world attention jumps to that. But I think it's our profession as ESG professionals and strategists to understand where the world is going, anticipate to that, and be prepared as far as one can be prepared, or trying to mitigate or trying to build bridges across these type of chasms and trying to understand where the world is going. I think that is the essence for me of strategy in the context of ESG. So maybe that's a topic that we could explore later on.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in what you're saying there, Robert. I think we're here amongst people that have been working in this space for many years. There's real expertise, right, on these topics. And I guess the most exciting part about these topics now being elevated and actually having such a big role in platforms like Davos is the fact that we are finally getting the corporate leadership to talk about them in a more significant way. But that brings me to the following question. I'm really curious about, your opinion on that. Of course, we're seeing a changing tone at the top, and I think most CEOs today will say it's a core priority for us. We need to transform. We need to transform into a sustainable business. We have net zero as a core priority, and we're setting goals. But considering that the expertise sometimes sits elsewhere, I'm curious if you feel like the conversations at Davos and the conversations that are happening between these CEOs and within the C-suite are bringing the right topics to the fore, and if so, why and how, and if not, what might be missing, and how can we bridge that gap if there is a gap?
I think anyone who's been working in this space for a long time is both hugely excited, but also quite surprised at how quickly this has risen up the agenda. It's what we've always wanted, right? It's getting attention. And I think you can't underestimate how hard sustainability practitioners have fought for that attention for the past 2 decades or more. We have been trying to convince business leaders, the investment community, consumers that this stuff matters. And now all of a sudden it does, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, not all of the attention has been great on ESG. There's a backlash in some quarters against ESG, and I think more alarmingly, a politicization of it. Mm-hmm. In some places, former VP Mike Pence just authored a WSJ article which likened ESG to the policies coming out of communist China, which is quite interesting. There's been expert opinions written in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, from folks who've quite frankly not ever implemented ESG inside of a company, which is interesting. And one of my favorite articles was actually by a gentleman named Andrew Winston, who wrote about the challenges of framing this as ESG and not sustainability, which I think was, if you haven't seen it, was really fascinating. My opinion on whether the conversations on this are the right ones at Davos is they're starting to be. There is a hyper focus right now on metrics and reporting that I wish that I think is hugely important. What gets measured gets done, as we all know, but there's a balance. And that balance is, if we spend all of our time on figuring out what the metrics are and doing the reporting, we're spending less time on making the business better and doing the implementation. And as important as it is with ESG regulation coming down the line it's important to create a level playing field for companies, but I worry that we are worrying too much about the wrong things: how to produce those reports, how to raise our ESG ratings, how to meet regulatory requirements, and missing the real opportunity around running a more inclusive and sustainable business. So I hope that some of those conversations are less about the metrics and more about the implementation. And frankly, I also hope they focus more on the S of ESG, which has been kind of been a little bit left out in a lot of the debate recently.
Yeah, interesting. I think, when you think about it, talking about ESG or sustainability in the context of metrics and reporting narrows it down to to a compliance exercise. And sometimes I feel that, talking about the harmonization of standards and the lack of harmonization in standards and the journey towards it is our great distraction, because I think you're right there in saying, it takes us away from maybe our own responsibility, right, in acting right now. Robert, you were talking about Davos and how it had a lot of action-oriented conversations, right? It was about action. How were the people who were talking about these issues able to connect their high level commitments into action, and on what topics did you see that occur?
Yeah, thanks, Marjella. Let me first also fully support what Amanda has been saying. I think the discussion around metrics is often driven by a reporting industry, and it's a smokescreen that keeps us from focusing on getting stuff done. and you can talk until the cows come home. And of course, it is really, really important to harmonize these metrics and to agree on something that is implementable and material. I fully agree that is really, really important. But that's not where the discussion should stop. That's where the discussion should start, right? These metrics should help to drive action agendas, focus on where the bang makes the buck, so to say. If you talk about, for instance, carbon abatement curves or something like that, it's really about understanding where the impact is. So where did I see that happen? Well, there are a couple of topics that I'm closely involved in with the background of Philips, of course, which is making healthcare accessible. So half of mankind does not have access to healthcare, which is a hugely complex topic, but also fascinating. We have said as a company, we want to empower access to healthcare in underserved communities for 400 million people by 2030, 300 million by 2025. And that's a core part of the company strategy to improve the lives of 2.5 billion people. So it's an integral part. And I think there is stuff happening when you talk about access to universal healthcare, more systemic approaches. So not maybe the other smokescreen, building on Amanda's elaboration on ESG metrics. I think the other smokescreen is technology is going to cure us, right? So technology innovation is happening at a very fast pace, but technology is agnostic towards values and outcomes. And if not guided, and that's the G in ESG governance, right? Making decisions in favor of all stakeholders. So if not guided, then technology will also only increase digital divide, inequity, accelerate deprivation of precious resources, ecosystems, and so forth. So having said that, this systemic approach is really important. Technology is moving. Access to care is one of the things that was discussed in the context of equity. Health equity was a big topic at the summit. The other two topics, climate action, of course, I think that was what you already mentioned already, Marjella. There are quite some great initiatives we can discuss that maybe a little bit more in detail. The CEO Alliance for Climate Leaders, the First Movers Alliance, and some others that try to make it. Circularity is a big topic, so moving away from make waste economies towards reusing, designing for reuse, basically creating more value with less waste. And also the understanding that circularity really is a key to enable our climate targets, global climate targets, right? So half of the emission reduction needs to come from circular models. So that are topics where I have seen in pockets people teaming up and new alliances being formed and really focusing on action agendas. I'm saying in pockets because you asked previously, are the right discussions being held? And I think you see some people that are flabbergasted, literally, I'm quoting, I think, somebody here. Some people are trying to orient themselves in the face of this volatility that's coming to us. Some people continue with ESG and greenwashing. And some people really try to focus on action agenda. So it's a quite broad field. And again, practical and implementable metrics will help to track progress and differentiate also towards consumers, regulators, and other stakeholders, the ones that do stuff and the ones that just talk about it.
Yeah, that's great. So what to do, right? How to operationalize. I was actually at an event last week in the Netherlands that brought together the top 100, 200 companies in the Netherlands and their CFOs. And it was really interesting to see how they seem to be all on board with how, moving towards being a sustainable business was business critical. It was your license to operate and the ability to be able to attract, capital as well as the right talent were obvious themes, but they were also admitting that from an education standpoint, there was a lack of understanding then how to actually operationalize that. Maybe now, going back to Katherine here, Duke Energy is obviously in the midst of this whole energy transition. How do you make that happen within Duke Energy, and what are the challenges maybe there in connecting the dots across leadership to the middle management and into the organization and into making it real, into really actioning this? What advice maybe would you have for CFOs and CEOs that have seen the light, but are still struggling to figure out how to really operationalize it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the unique things about Duke, and I've been at Duke now for almost 2 years, and it was one of my pleasant surprises when I joined, is that we say our climate strategy is our business strategy. And so for us, there's no daylight between kind of what you would say is the core business priority and then our ESG priorities. So we've got a goal towards net zero with a number of interim targets, and our 30,000 or so workforce, every single person has a role to play in helping us get to net zero from a planning perspective, from a build perspective, et cetera. And so if you look at from the board on down, ESG is kind of woven throughout. So that has not been a challenge for me at this company, which, having worked in this field for 20 plus years, is such a welcome surprise, because typically you are kind of, typically I have been on the outside, even though I've worked at the company, trying to understand what are the issues that are really relevant, how are they creating risk or potentially creating value, and then how do I partner with the business and really figure out how to embed the work so that the business really owns this, so that we're really core to it. That's not been where I've been focused at Duke. I think it's been more kind of navigating the clean energy transition writ large. And I would say that from a technology perspective, my sense is we've got the solution in the near term. There's some work to do in the future, looking at some new technologies and making sure they're commercialized and at scale and all that kind of stuff that's going to get us all the way to net zero. I'm thinking about advanced nuclear, hydrogen, some of those things that are incredibly promising, carbon capture, et cetera. But for me, I want to highlight a point that Amanda made, that I like, if I could have jumped out of my seat and agreed more, I don't know how I would have done it, but it's the S of ESG, which I think does not get as much focus as it probably should. And so when I think about, yeah, the getting to net zero from a technical perspective is going to be hard, but I'm confident we can do it. We've got the right people in the right seats with the right subject matter expertise. We can figure that problem out. It's the S, which is what kind of keeps me up at night. So what are impacts to energy affordability as we think about energy insecurity, energy burden, energy equity? How are we thinking about environmental justice? So how do we engage in dialogue with the communities that we're going to be going back into for the first time, and making sure that their voice is part of the conversation with respect to the clean energy transition? And then I also think of other issues like the just transition. So we're leading the largest planned retirement of coal in our industry in the US. We're planning to retire 16 gigawatts of coal in roughly the next decade. That's, if you're not in the energy sector, that may not be meaningful, but it's a huge source of generation. And so how are we thinking about the impacts to employees, the impacts to those local communities that have those facilities in them? And so from where I sit, the pace of our ability to execute the clean energy transition will be defined by how we navigate the S.
Interesting.
Robert, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, very interesting. I think similarly, maybe for the material transition, right? When we talk about circularity, I mean, technically a lot can be done. It's the combination of circular economy, so understanding the economical impact, and at the same time engineering for equitable and accessible and inclusive economies also. So the S needs to be designed in, and that goes for all these types of transitions. So yeah, it strikes me interesting. I've never thought about the importance of the S in the energy transition from Katherine's perspective, but it makes a lot of sense and resonates. Yeah, maybe to your question, Marjella, I think it's about transformation, right, in the entire organization. And I always have this picture of the Dutch bike lock with these 4 different numbers that you need to get in a row before you can take the bike and go away. It's not just one number. So if you have great communications and engagement internally, that's one of the 4, but you also need to really engage and empower your leaders to walk the talk. You need to build the capabilities, including design and strategy, so that people know how to do that. And then you need to embed it in the processes, including design processes, strategy processes, HR processes, remuneration, alignment with long and short-term incentives, and of course. And all of these things need to happen. And I think that requires a lot of learning in a very short amount of time. And so if everybody is continuously stretched and overloaded after 2 years of COVID, and I think that's a situation that many of us recognize, and the teams also, we need to push back as leaders and create that space for learning, even at the executive level, even at supervisory board and board member levels. There's so much knowledge that decision makers need to pick up. They don't, I mean, the CEO and the E in CEO does not stand for chief expert, right? He doesn't need to know everything in detail, but they need to have the framework. They need to know what TCFD is. They need to know what the Science-Based Target Initiative is. And so forth. They need to speak language to be able to make a decision and get the right stakeholders on the table. That requires time and a conscious effort.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit more. You know, how do you get the leadership to focus, right, on the right set of issues, also knowing that there are so many potentially, there are so many different perspectives, there are so many different layers of the conversation, the strategic conversation, the metrics conversation. So how do you guys work with that leadership on getting the right focus? Because ultimately, you know, you can do E&S really, really well if you get the G sorted, you know, that governance piece. So I'm curious to hear your stories about how you make it simple enough, not, you know, reduce the complexity in a way that would be harmful.
So I think it starts with having or getting everyone on the same page about priorities. And honestly, in my 20 years in this field, I've never said materiality more often than I have in the last 3 to 6 months, and had conversations about what it means, which I think is changing in the minds of many people inside companies. But we have to know what's most material for our company, so that materiality analysis, which has been such a foundational part of our work for the last decade at least, is becoming increasingly important. It is understanding what do our stakeholders think, understanding our impacts on society, understanding society's impacts on us, and then working with the right leaders inside the business, getting them around the table to figure out the strategy for addressing those issues. Then there's the governance mechanisms and making sure we have the right oversight mechanisms in place, whether that's at board or exec level, or even a steering committee or whatever a company might call it, of the key leaders who need to be involved in implementation against those priorities. But those components are increasingly important. And yes, there's also reporting and metrics and having goals and targets. But there's also, I think, an increasing role for stakeholder engagement and helping leaders hear from stakeholders, whether those are consumers or investors or employees, as was mentioned, and thinking of new ways to respond to the needs of those stakeholders. I think all of those things are becoming increasingly important, but the more that we are flexing those muscles with more teams and leaders inside of our companies, the better we're getting at that. That's what I would say on that one.
And Amanda, would you say it's coming from, you know, both directions? You know, on the one hand, you know, as a leader in this space, you're pushing this information up, right? You want to help get these things as clear and as actionable as possible. Do you also sense that the demand for you know, this kind of knowledge is also becoming more firmed up from the top level down?
100%. So I think boards are feeling the pressure to understand what this means for their companies and to ask executives how they're approaching ESG. I think finance and legal teams are feeling the pressure of regulation coming down the line and having to get up to speed at an incredible pace on something that is really complicated, and where we don't speak the same languages. I mean, the number of conversations I've had about, for example, the SEC proposed climate ruling, and trying to talk with finance and legal teams about what are the right responses to that and how do we put the right infrastructure in place to address it. Just talking to people across the aisle, we'll use it in the political phrase, across the aisle, it's a totally different set of phrases and a different lingo and language that we're talking in. So I think that has added an extraordinary pressure on more people inside the company to understand this stuff. And of course, yes, there's a groundswell from employees who, especially young employees, who are empowered to use their voices to advocate more inside their companies, to ask for changes that they want to see so that they can feel proud to work for a sustainable business. So I think, it's bottom up and top down, and we're sandwiched in the middle, some of us as sustainability professionals, and our heads are exploding. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, not surprisingly. I think, that as heads of sustainability, you are the chief catalysts on these issues and the cheerleaders on these issues. Over time, how have you seen your roles shift? How has that evolved? And do you also feel that, at the C-suite level, there's one specific role that is best equipped to be the owner for these issues, or is it really something that should be carried across the organization?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I feel like this field has evolved. You had kind of compliance and then beyond compliance, and then I think it really kind of hit its initial stride, and that an era I refer to as the corporate social responsibility era. The nice to do, you were doing the glossy reports, kind of here's what I did last summer, and it was the nice to do. And then we shifted,
case studies.
Yeah. And then we shifted to the world of sustainability, which was, you really should do this. And I kind of liken it to do your homework, eat your peas, like just, this is stuff you should be doing. And sometimes you had success and sometimes you were kind of batting your head against a wall, being like, yo, we really need to do this. And I think now that we're in the world of ESG, this is really a must do. It's a business imperative. And it's really all about how a company is leading strategy on navigating risk and creating value. And the strategy for Duke Energy with respect to ESG would fundamentally be different than Philips or than Meta. And so I think the role of that head of sustainability, head of ESG, is to make sure that we're bringing and surfacing the right voices and perspectives to really inform our peers, the leaders at the company, to make sure that we're not missing anything, that we're confident we've got the right strategy in place. To the points people have been making, we're dialing up the right things and we're dialing down the wrong things, because you can't do it all, and you certainly can't do it all effectively. So making sure you've got your arms around really the core issues that truly matter. And on the point of materiality, I think there are a lot of views on how you define that. When I was at WWF, we would get this question all the time. And then when I was in my last role, we would get this question all the time. Where do I focus? Where do I get started? And I would always say, you ask two fundamental questions, and then you validate it and you do all of the work. But the two questions I always like to say you need to ask are, what matters to the company and what does the company matter to? And what matters to the company is often a question of what is a financial impact, a risk. If you don't get it right, you're in real kind of license to operate, fundamental challenge. And then what you matter to, these are opportunities to create value for something. So are you a large buyer of X or Y, or do you have a large workforce? How are you defining the norms? And so I think staying focused on kind of what matters is a useful filtering device to keep some of there's a lot of noise in the space, but to keep a lot of the noise at bay.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how that materiality concept that, originally existed within the, let's say, sustainability reporting standards, and was more of an operational exercise to figure out the topics for your report, has really become that strategic foundation. And I think that's the right application for it, right? If these issues are truly material, that's an exercise that should be done at the highest level of the organization, and information that should also be shared at the highest level of the organization.
Marjella, let me just double plus on what both ladies have said.
Sure. So
it's little to add, and I think that was an excellent summary from your side, and it's great that I'm not the one who has to explain this in this forum. I think we're all on the same page about the importance of materiality. That is the core. I just wanted to add one sentence on the shifting role of the sustainability function, or the chief sustainability officer. There has been a lot published on the topic recently, also from the Big Four, the consulting firms, what have you not. One of the quotes that I very much liked was interpreting the title CSO as Chief Sense-Making Officer. Right?
That's great.
I think with that broad perspective on societal trends, material trends that are happening, we are or should be with our teams in a unique position to understand what's happening, and not just enable fact and data-based decision-making, but provide context and interpret. And I think that is really crucial. I think Amanda referred to that also, right? Talking across the aisle, so translating insights into the language of the CFO or the Chief Human Resource Officer or the Chief Marketing Officer. They all speak different languages, but I think we ought to have the capability of being able to translate the concept of value creation in their different realms and link them to the long-term social environmental trends and the planetary boundary conditions. So that's really cool. And I think it's a great challenge to build these capabilities and stay up to date and be at the right speaking level, so to say.
Yeah.
And I think it came back also with what Katherine has been saying about the shifting roles throughout the years.
Yeah, I think at current there's a really active role to play there for the head of sustainability or the chief sustainability officer, right? And making sure that we actually know how to communicate these things and what processes we need. There's just a lot of groundwork still to be done in terms of building those structures internally. I think over time, you would hope that all the CEOs are actually a chief sustainability officer. And in that sense, I would say I would take it one notch up. I think a lot of chief sustainability officers are actually really well positioned to lead their organization into the future and are probably the future CEOs, or at least that's my hope.
Marjella, you asked a really important question. I don't know that any of us answered it, which is where should this sit?
Yeah, where should this sit
under the company? And I would say, for me, it doesn't matter as long as it's sitting somewhere where it is properly resourced, where the leader has the influence to bring along the rest of the leaders in the company to what this means, where the leader has the understanding that it is not a box ticking exercise, it is not a reporting exercise, it is a performance improvement and a change management exercise, and where there is access to other executives and to the board to really drive the agenda. So those are my kind of conditions for where it needs to sit. And whether that's a chief financial officer, a chief legal officer, a chief communications officer, a chief marketing officer, I think depends on the nature of the business.
Yeah,
I completely agree.
Yep.
Robert, same point of view on that one too?
Same point of view, maybe one thing to add, we talked about materiality. So if you think about materiality in our business, then 70 to 80% of the impact, both environmental and social, is in the use phase. That's why I've always made a very strong plea in the case to the CEO to have this in the corner of innovation and strategy. So that's why I'm still a member of the innovation strategy team. I also have a reporting line to our chief legal, and we have an ESG committee that's chaired by our CEO. So, I mean, it doesn't matter, as Amanda said, but you need to have access to the innovation and strategy agendas and roadmaps if you want to make a difference. And it can be different in the industry. I think if you are at a big FMCG or food producer, then probably 80% of your impact is upstream, and maybe you want to be more close to the chief purchasing officer. But again, materiality is an important concept here.
Great. So let's go back to the topic of today, which started, of course, with the impact and the influence of Davos. Looking at, and this is a question for all three of you again, what you try to achieve, right, on a day-to-day basis within your companies. Is there anything concrete you could think of that Davos could do better in future? So when leadership comes back home and, Robert, you go back home on the train, you think, oh, actually, tomorrow I'm going to start this because Davos enabled that. What could Davos do better?
Yeah, I mean, again, we talked about what Davos is and what it isn't, right? So in that sense, the question is, what would you expect from the WEF as an organization? Mm-hmm. What do you expect from us as participants? What do you expect? What can I expect from myself personally? And I think that are different levels and good questions to ask ourselves. Maybe very briefly on the WEF organization, I think there's a lot that can and should be done, not just in addressing appearances, but I mean this very elite bubble, so to say, is in itself, I think, a challenge in a world that's increasingly polarizing. I don't know how to address that, but I think it is a challenge for the relevance of Davos. And I'm sure that very smart people are thinking about it and engaging, hopefully, with the right stakeholders to find a way to address that. Then maybe towards the participants of such a gathering, I would say come well prepared and with open agendas, not just your own agendas, but a willingness to really listen. And maybe spend time with people that have these opposing views, right? To get out of your bubble. I think that's a huge value of readjusting and kind of reorienting and understand different perspectives and enhance your perspective on making a better model of the world, so to say, and then engage. And on a personal level, I think, yeah, it's really about also being open, but also taking that with me. So one of the things that resonated deeply this year was, for instance, the appeal from Elizabeth Watuti, climate leader from Kenya. And she said, it's not just about the heads, it's also about the hearts. So being also emotionally engaged, understanding what the, could really say empathetic, right? What's going on in the world. I think that's an important part also of being a full human, not just a decision-making machine, so to say. Some people talked about more female styles of leadership. Doesn't need to be women, can also be men, but I think being more inclusive, open, less egocentric, there are interesting insights. So I think these three levels, the WEF organization, the participants, and we personally, how do we reflect what do we want to get in? So setting an intent and what do we take home is important to make this successful for me in the future years.
Thank you. Katherine, Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know that I have any comment about Davos, but as Robert was speaking, I was kind of referring back to a few moments in my professional career that have been real unlocks for me. And I think, particularly given it's been 2 years of a pandemic, and I think people have been kind of holed up in their homes or their offices, but when I think of moments of real professional growth where I've really understood an issue just fundamentally differently, it's been when I've been out in the field. And so I think it's really easy to sit in a room with a variety of experts, wherever it may be, and read reports and have really important dialogues and convince yourselves that you understand truly the dynamics at play. When I went to the field to see palm oil plantations, for example, in Indonesia, climbing on fishing vessels and Southeast Asia, meeting with plant workers and on Duke Energy's facilities, these are moments where I really can kind of test out whether or not the theory that I, as a sustainability practitioner, have cooked up about kind of what is the theory of change, therefore what is the theory of action, do I have it right? And so I guess it's not a comment about Davos so much as it can't just be Davos. We cannot solve these issues without that fundamental probing, testing, sitting across from someone and really deep, making sure you've really validated your assumptions, because there's so much room for unintended consequence in this space.
I will just plus one to both of those things. I thought those were amazing comments, and maybe build on Katherine's point by saying, I'd love to see more of the implementation conversation come into Davos. I think it's hugely important to have CEO buy-in and very senior leadership buy-in on sustainability and ESG. I want the agenda to now shift from why it's important, hugely important to talk about that, to how we're going to do it. And I think, to some of Robert's earlier points, those conversations are actually already happening at Davos. You know, we talked about circularity. I wasn't there this year, but I've been there several years previously. You know, when the refugee crisis was happening in Syria, there were lots of conversations about how business should be involved in that. All of these conversations are really important, but they're happening kind of in dots around the main forum, or they're happening in isolation from this concept that is, how should companies manage ESG? I don't know that everyone understands that that is the implementation. And so connecting that big concept level CEO conversation with how do you do this stuff is something I think Davos has a role in thinking through going forward. And just as part of that, elevating the role of CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers, and having more Chief Sustainability Officers at the event who are trying to navigate all of this. Sorry, Robert.
No, I fully agree, Amanda. I just want to say that it leads us back a little bit to the earlier conversation that we had about not just watching the earthquake, but seeing the earth crust move, right? So interpreting, it's not just, oh, gee, we have a crisis, what do we do? But it is looking ahead and understanding what are the underlying things and what needs to happen, and what is the role of business in that. I think sometimes we get a little bit hyped and swept away with the things that just happen to be the crisis at the moment. I think there will always be a crisis and it will always be terrible, but we need to understand the underlying mechanisms better. And this is, I think, where such a gathering can also help to align global agendas and really make these long-term commitments across business and NGOs and governments.
Great. So I think we're getting to the end of our conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for participating today. Also one of my main takeaways for today is that it is really key that we keep on connecting with one another, as humans, and trying to also find that emotional connection that sways people over to act on these issues. And therefore, happy that we can go back to the office, although in a flexible way, and also see each other at these platforms again. And great to connect with you today on this. Any closing statements any of you would like to make?
Great pleasure being with you. I very much enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. I'm really looking forward to working with all of you on whatever direction we're going next in this journey that we've all been on. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I would love to just take this conversation, and if we were all in person, just go meet for coffee or for a drink or for a walk, and because I think we could have spoken for hours. So it was really enjoyable.
Thanks so much, and see you soon.